On your left is the new Samsung S90C QD-OLED. On your right is last year's Samsung S95B, both 55 inches in screen size. The S90C retail unit we bought ourselves appeared to have a similar screen coating as last year's S95B, muting reflections effectively but turning grey when hit by light. If we run this image retention torture test where we displayed a peak white window at full blast in HDR for 10 seconds, then switched to a full-field grey slide, you can see both QD OLEDs clearing away the afterglow at roughly the same rate. HDR peak brightness at different window sizes were also neck and neck. If anything, our S95B retail unit was actually marginally brighter than our S90C sample. All these findings indicate that our Samsung S90C is equipped with the same QD OLED panel as last year's S95B, although there is a chance that later production runs may start using newer 2023 QD OLED panels. Before you start dismissing the S90C in favor of last year's S95B due to the latter's greater affordability after one whole year of price drops, Samsung has actually implemented a number of picture quality improvements on the newer model. 1. When tone mapping HDR titles with a maximum mastering display luminance or max MDL of 4000 nits, the Samsung S90C would start rolling off later along the PQ curve than the S95B, ensuring that the APL or average picture level in HDR movies graded conservatively in a 4000 nit container won't become as dark as what's seen on last year's QD OLED model. However, because the roll-off begins later, there is less room for bright highlight detail to be fully expressed on the S90C, occasionally leading to more clipping of specular highlights compared to the S95B. Perhaps a better solution would be to tone map based on MaxCL or maximum content light level metadata, similar to what's done by LG Electronics, Panasonic or Philips, maybe next year. Upgrade number 2 on the Samsung S90C is in the handling of HLG HDR content, such that dark HLG sequences, for example this beach scene in House of the Dragon served from the Skystream box whose HDR is output in hybrid log gamma, won't exhibit the blue-purplish blockiness witnessed on last year's S95B. In terms of auto-dimming in prolonged dark HDR scenes, the algorithm has been tweaked to be slightly less aggressive on the S90C. Although given enough time, it would still dim down to such an extent that you need to summon the user menu to restore the brightness. So viewers who are sensitive to this issue may want to consider venturing into the service menu to switch off auto-dimming, at the risk of voiding your warranty. New for 2023, there is an HDR tone mapping setting in the picture menu. The default value in HDR filmmaker mode is static, which keeps dynamic tone mapping disabled. Switching it to active would engage dynamic tone mapping, which tended to overbrighten the entire picture, therefore deviating from the creative intent. So we reverted to static quicker than a radio presenter's tongue when reading the terms and conditions in adverts. Otherwise, the Samsung S90C QD-OLED shares many similarities with last year's S95B in many aspects of picture quality. Bright uniformity was top-notch, with no sign of banding, dirty screen effect or color tinting on full-field grey slides, although dark uniformity on our retail sample wasn't as clean as that observed on many other QD OLED panels since launch last year. Just like on the S95B, there's some crushing of shadow detail in both SDR and HDR modes on the S90C. Unfortunately, this couldn't be fully rectified by merely increasing the shadow detail setting, which would introduce floating blacks in certain scenes. On a positive note, the Samsung S90C continued to be free of near black chrominance overshoot artifacts, thanks to the absence of white subpixels in QD OLED's makeup. Here, you may also be able to see that the colors in very dark scenes would look slightly desaturated compared to a reference monitor, a trait we've pointed out on previous QD OLEDs. Talking about colors, out-of-the-box accuracy in SDR filmmaker mode on our sample was already reasonably good without any sort of calibration, translating to natural and cinematic colors in real-world viewing. using the provided CMS or color management system in an attempt to bring the delta errors down would introduce more polarization, visible on this color ramp test pattern as we switched between movie mode where CMS was untouched and filmmaker mode with CMS calibration, so we ended up just resetting all our CMS adjustments. Like on all Samsung televisions, the color space auto setting on the S90C QD-OLED doesn't actually auto-switch, and will always adopt the color gamut value under the color space custom submenu. If left at its default setting of DCI P3, color saturation tracking would be more accurate to P3 standards, but the Rec 2020 color gamut coverage would be clamped at 77%, instead of utilizing up to 91% Rec 2020 as permitted by QD-OLED technology. In addition, the DCI P3 color gamut setting manifested more polarization at certain tones, whereas the Rec 2020 setting presented smoother 10-bit gradation. Bottom line is, both color gamut settings have their respective pros and cons, and until Samsung implements proper color space auto-switching in line with other OLED brands, users will be forced to put up with some shortcomings whichever setting they choose. Motion on the S90C was classic Samsung, exhibiting similar quirks to what we've seen before on previous TVs from the South Korean manufacturer. On our sample, engaging picture clarity was necessary to activate 5.5 pull-down and eradicate telegenic judder in 24 frames per second movies. We made sure to zero out the judder reduction setting under the custom submenu to avoid introducing soap opera effect or SOE and interpolation artifacts. However, just like on most Samsung TVs we've tested over the years, the 24p motion processing seemed to work on a scene-by-scene basis, even with picture clarity disabled, applying interpolation for one frame before switching it off for the remainder of the scene, causing a visible stutter immediately after certain scene cuts, for example in our own custom-ordered interpolation detection test pattern. Luckily, we only saw this 24p motion hiccup very rarely when watching real-world content, and so weren't overly bothered. Motion interpolation with 50Hz broadcast material we get in PAL countries such as the United Kingdom appeared to have been improved, incurring less microstutter artifacts than before. Clear motion blackframe insertion or BFI remained a no-go for us, due to excessive light loss and flicker, not to mention forced interpolation with 50Hz content, which is Samsung's workaround to mask the inevitable frame rate conversion judder caused by the 60Hz BFI. In terms of video processing, the Samsung S90C did not handle low bitrate material as well as LG and Sony OLEDs for a few reasons. 1. There continues to be no smooth gradation setting on the TV, which means in-content polarization in heavily compressed material will be fully exposed without mitigation. 2. Overscan cannot be disabled in standard definition resolution on the S90C. For instance, on this SMPTE RP133 test card in 576i, leading to a more zoomed-in and slightly softer standard def presentation. And 3. Although the television correctly detected and processed 3:2 cadence in film-based interlaced material, it failed to do so for 2:2 cadence, which is far more common in the UK and other PAL regions, even with film mode enabled. Thankfully, high-definition broadcast and 1080p Blu-rays were upscaled well to come across reasonably sharp, helped in no small part by QD-OLED's insanely high native contrast. Native 10-bit gradation was very good, with minimal polarization seen in the skies of The Martian, so the lack of a smooth gradation decontouring filter isn't a problem at all when watching 4K Blu-rays. With game mode engaged, input lag measured as low as 9.2 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, dropping to 4.7 milliseconds at 120 frames per second, which is as responsive as you can get on a consumer TV for playing fast-action games. 4 HDMI 2.1 ports are provided, each supporting the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, as well as 24 gigabits per second of DSC or display stream compression. Even 4K 144Hz refresh rate is supported, giving the Samsung S90C a slight advantage over LG OLED TVs which remain capped at 4K 120Hz, although realistically this will only benefit PC gamers with high-end graphics cards. On the latest UK firmware of 11.11 at the time we filmed this video in April 2023, setting game HDR to basic was actually the closest Samsung has come to implementing proper HDRG support on its TV. Yes, it is still slightly over-brightened versus PQ, but because there's no dynamic tone mapping at play with HDR tone mapping set to static, we could set maximum tone map luminance to 1250 nits and maximum full-frame tone map luminance to 900 nits, which delivered an impactful HDR presentation with pop and depth in HDRG-compliant games. While switching the game picture mode to original produced more accurate PQ EOTF and color saturation tracking, it's not available with game HDR engaged, so you would have to go into the game mode settings submenu, click on Game Picture Expert, then turn Game HDR off. With this configuration, the Samsung S90C QD-OLED will revert to a 4000 nit tone curve since consoles don't send out metadata for games, so you won't be able to obtain the maximum accuracy and impact from HDRG compliant games. In fact, any game that lets you set the peak brightness in-game. Our preference is still to take advantage of the pseudo HDRG support conferred by Game HDR Basic. Let's just hope that Samsung doesn't nuke it in a future firmware update. VRR including unofficial NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility provided buttery smooth gameplay without noticeable tearing or frame drops. But similar to all consumer TVs we've tested, some VRR flicker was inevitable in a handful of VRR games during more sedate scenes and on static menus. 444 chroma was fully reproduced in PC mode, and native 10-bit gradation was good, judging from this gray ramp pattern in the Display HDR app. Just like on all QD-OLED displays, the red, green and blue subpixels on the S90C are arranged in a triangle, contributing to color fringing on fine text, so most people should refrain from using the TV as a PC monitor for work and productivity purposes. Since no Samsung TV support Dolby Vision, naturally you won't be able to play games in Dolby Vision from the Xbox Series X on the S90C. But given that the Dolby Vision game mode on the latest LG OLEDs was over-brightened and couldn't be corrected via AutoCal at the time we filmed this video in April 2023 anyway, we don't think the lack of Dolby Vision gaming support is a deal-breaker at all. Despite the ultra-thin panel, our unit wasn't bent by the way. The Samsung S90C was able to generate impressive sound, delivering sufficient bass as well as pleasant mids and highs to satisfy casual viewing, especially if you use the amplify setting to widen the soundstage. The Tizen-based Smart TV interface on the Samsung S90C feels snappier than on last year's S95B, but remains clunkier and more confusing than the UI adopted by rival brands, especially if you just want to switch input sources or adjust the settings using the pared-down smart remote. All the key streaming apps and UK catch-up TV services are on board. To sum up, the Samsung S90C is an iterative improvement over last year's S95B, featuring better tone mapping of HDR movies graded conservatively within a 4000 nit container, correct handling of HLG HDR material, official 144Hz refresh rate support, as well as slightly less sluggish Smart TV experience. Due to the myriad of politics between OLED panel vendors and TV manufacturers, the Samsung S90C is actually shaping up to be the most affordable 2023 QD-OLED TV to hit store shelves this year, allowing you to enjoy the technology's class-leading screen uniformity, cleaner near-black handling without flashing artifacts, wide viewing angles without off-axis tinting, and high color luminance, all without having to pay a flagship price. In fact, its HDR peak brightness of 1000 nits and full screen brightness of 200 nits will outperform any non-MLA WRGB OLED TVs including the LG C3 and the Sony A80L, making the Samsung S90C arguably the best mid-range OLED TV you can buy on the market, and so it earns our highly recommended Best Value award. Of course, no TV is perfect, and shortcomings on this Samsung S90C QD-OLED include suboptimal motion processing, lack of Dolby Vision support, and clunky Smart TV interface. Samsung's image processing philosophy also continues to favor artificial pop over outright accuracy, which is particularly frustrating on the gaming front, given the S90C's class-leading input lag, 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, natively high color luminance at 144Hz refresh rate, the last of which is not supported by any other non-Samsung OLED TV on the market right now. If you're undecided about which OLED TV to buy, one place where you can get good advice is at Richer Sounds, a trusted British AV retailer with more than 50 stores in the UK, as well as a secure e-commerce platform for online purchases. If you join the company's VIP club, you will also get 6 years warranty included on the vast majority of TVs. So visit your local Richer Sounds store or online at richersounds.com for your next TV purchase. Thanks again for your support. Okay, some of you may be concerned about the apparently higher risk of burn-in on QD OLEDs, based on rthings.com's accelerated OLED burn-in test. Now, you have to understand that their test is an extreme torture test where the televisions were set to maximum brightness, running only one CNN feed between 15 and 20 hours a day without ever changing channels, which doesn't represent normal daily usage at all. Even rthings themselves said that their test is not ground to avoid QD OLEDs. As long as you vary the content you watch on screen, you shouldn't encounter any problem. Okay, if you are considering buying the Samsung S90C QD-OLED, you may be interested in the LG C3 or the Sony A80L II, in which case you might want to check out my side-by-side HDR comparison video by clicking here.